into part one, which is I will do part one, geographic, political, and the demographics and the economics. And this will give you a good understanding of the US market here. Just as an overview. And if you can. So the US is the fourth largest in territory, whereas between Canada and Mexico, as you can tell, unlike other continents and maybe Australia, there's only three major countries in North America: Canada, which you'll hear from our colleagues Jan in a few weeks, the United States, and then to our south is Mexico. And there's quite a bit of trade that goes from north to south, south to north. And this is actually facilitated by the United States, Mexico, Canada Free Trade Agreement, which is the second free trade agreement that followed NAFTA that was renegotiated a few years under the Trump administration. But there's, as you will see, that the rail industry is really connected between these three excuse me, these three that we have rail companies that are in Canada, they have tracks in operations in the United States, and the US companies that have operations in Mexico. So if you kind of look at this North American market, you almost have to look at it as a single market as opposed to a separate three different countries, because they're so interrelated and connected. From a geographic area standpoint, the United States in of itself from one country is about the size of all of Europe. So if you can imagine going from east to west or west to east and north to south, it would be similar to going from, let's say, Sweden to Italy, from Russia to Spain. And because of our large territory, we have differences between the states and we have differences between the regions. And this is really important when you start developing the business, because it's there could be regional differences. And so, you know, many countries in Europe has regional differences between one province or one state to the other. That is definitely the same situation here in the United States, but on a much wider territorial. Our climate, we have every climate that is on the earth here. We have tropical down in tip of Florida here all the way to Hawaii. We have rainforests up here in the north. It's kind of interesting. It's there's a whole segment where it rains every single day here in Washington State and Oregon. We have temperate climate here where the green is in the southeast. We have a cold climate. This is where we're located, where it will get down to minus 25, minus 30 during the winter. And then we have a more of a temperate, cool climate here in Midwest. We have an desert here in Arizona and eastern California, Nevada, where Las Vegas is. We have a mountain range, which is semi-arid, and we also have quite a areas of diversity. So you can get practically every climate that there is in one country right here. The establishment of the states, we have 50 individual states in one district. That's the District of Columbia, which is where our national capital is. We have other territories and possessions like Puerto Rico. But if we were looking at the states itself, there is some, while we're 50 individual states, and we'll explain the reason why that is and the ramifications of that. But if you break it down into regions, we have the Northeast and the Southeast here. And the East Coast was first developed by the colonials from the UK, from Spain, and Netherlands. Yeah, those are the three main. And then, of course, our neighbor the southwest here, where Texas is, these are huge states that border Mexico. We have California and the West Coast. We're both here in the upper Midwest, in the Midwest, and then we have the Rocky Mountains in areas here. So we basically, if you wanted to break down the 50 states, or at least put them in some type of a regional, we would probably break them up in these particular regions. Saying so. Even the Southeast, this is a wide territory here. This is about 1,000 miles. So what's that, 1,600 kilometers? And that's only one region of the United States. Our government, we have three forms of government: legislature, executive, and judicial. And I think this is kind of similar in other democracies, but there's probably some significant differences when doing business in the United States. So the legislative branch of any, whether it's the U.S. Congress that's based in Washington, and we have representatives from every state and every district, or the state legislature, which is organized similarly, or even your local city, village council is on a territorial basis. We have the legislative branch. And so this legislative branch is in charge of passing laws, not necessarily individual regulations, but passing laws. And so the major Congress is the Congress, the state legislatures, and the city councilors. Their job is to pass the laws. The executive branch here, whether it's the president at the federal level, a governor at the state level, or even mayor or city manager at the local level, their job is to execute those laws. But in the course of the execution, they will issue regulations. And these regulations may be very pertinent to commerce in that particular area. So it's a difference between the laws that are done and the regulations that are issued by the executive branches. And we'll be going through some of the rail, federal, and the state regulatory regulations later on in this presentation. But it's really important that the executive branch is separate from the legislative branch, and there is a constant going back and forth. And we'll get into that in greater detail tomorrow. And then, of course, we have the judicial branch, which is basically if there's a dispute between the executive branch, the legislature, or a business, or between two parties, then it's up to the courts to actually decide that. And we have local courts, both criminal and civil. We have state courts, both criminal and civil, and we have federal courts as well. And of course, the top is the Supreme Court. So if a local court needs to be appealed, they'll go to the state court. The state court, if that issue needs to be appealed, then it goes to the federal courts or the Supreme Court. And so everybody's looking at the Supreme Court because at the end of the day, whatever the Supreme Court decides tends to be the final say in the law of the land. This is the three and the second comment that I will make, and we'll talk about this a little later tomorrow, is that the U.S. Constitution that was actually initially ratified in the late 18th century in 1787 actually just specifies what the federal government can regulate and what they do not specify what they cannot regulate, but they specify in the Constitution what they can control and regulate. And so when they start looking at that, is that anything that's not in the US Constitution is really up to the states to regulate. So you're going to have this myriad of regulations that are at the federal level, and then you're going to have a myriad of regulations that are at the state and local level. So if there is a dispute or a movement between states that is of the federal direction, so interstate commerce, but if it's something that is just within the state, then it's up to the state to control that. And so there could be some federal regulations if it's movement between states, but if it's solely within one state, that is the jurisdiction of that particular state. So if you kind of look at where we started, and you look at the brief history, the history of the United States, we're nowhere near as old as any of the societies or countries in Europe. But we are a country of immigrants. Our immigrants came in the 16th, 17th century from various countries in Europe, and throughout the course of history, that our origins are immigrants. And the only native population that was here was the Native Americans. And one could actually claim that those are immigrants as well from Asia. But they were been here for thousands of years. Our country is relatively new when you match it up against other societies and other cultures around the world, whether it's from Asia or Europe. We were first discovered by Columbus in 1492. And of course, there was a migration over the years. The country, we continue to be a country of immigrants, but the immigration has changed over time. And now we are not getting immigrants from Europe most of the time, but most of our immigrants are from Latin America and from Asia, and now from other countries, let's say refugees from Afghanistan, as well as Syria and others. But we are a country of immigrants. And a lot of people will say, hey, is the United States a salad bowl, which is a bunch of people that have different cultures living together, or are we a melting pot? And quite frankly, we would say we're a melting pot, that after one or two generations that we are all Americans. Again, we're started with the 13 colonies. The immigrants that come here usually have a strong independence and a very entrepreneurial feel to them. And this has really led to a society and a view of government that they distrust government in favor of individual rights. And so our first 10 amendments to our Constitution guarantee certain rights of speech, bearing of arms, religion, and alike, that we are very individualistic. So even in our pandemic, a lot of the regulation was very local, very individual. It was up to the individual to decide if they're going to wear a mask or not wear a mask. We are not necessarily very societal. This has actually moved into business as well, and we're going to be talking about some of the business cultural factors. But the individual is the rights of the individual trumps the rights of the society. And from a form of government, we have relegated, and the world knows that we have basically two parties, Republicans and Democrats, and we swip back and forth between who's the president from what party, as well as who's in the majority of the legislature branches. This is the case in every state. On the local city level, typically party doesn't really matter because it is such a local thing. It would, in larger cities, you will have a party system, but in villages that, let's say, have 10,000 inhabitants, you really don't have that party system, but definitely at the national, state, in the larger communities. We are a member of almost every major international organization. The United States is a permanent member of the Security Council, part of the G7, as well as the IMF, the World Organization. The United Nations is based in New York. Various organizations, the WTO, you're in NATO. Everybody's talking about NATO in the war in Ukraine as well. And just a member of almost every major international organization. From a political standpoint and a social context, our population, we're 335 million. Our population density is rather high in certain areas and very low in other areas. So if you kind of look in the New York, New Jersey area, very high concentration, very urban. cities here of New York, New Jersey, Boston, Washington, D.C., this whole area, Philadelphia. This is very highly concentrated in population. Same with South Florida, very high concentration in Florida throughout this whole Gulf Coast on the West Coast as well as the East Coast. Illinois is high concentration because of Chicago here. We have Ohio, which is multiple million inhabited cities here, and of course California. So we have Los Angeles here, San Francisco, high concentration of individuals, multi-million. LA is something like 10 million inhabitants in that whole area. Texas has also a high concentration in Houston, Dallas, Austin, but because of the wide area, it doesn't really come up with the dark black as well. Texas being our second largest state in territory. The largest is Alaska. And so you have a concentration here. You go up to the north, Rocky area and the Plains area in Wyoming, Montana, North and South Dakota. You will go for miles and kilometers, tens of kilometers without seeing an individual. So there are ranches up here that are 40 kilometers by 40 kilometers in size, and all you see is cattle. So it's kind of like going into Australia and seeing sheep. Well, you're going to see cattle up here. And our average age is 38. And our population distribution is rather flat over the generations here. We have our baby boomers in this particular area here. Of course, they're dying off as age goes on. And unfortunately, the pandemic has not been very kind to them as well. We have the Gen X, Gen Y generation, which is very flat. We have the millennials in this particular area, which is the greater. And then, of course, we have the alpha generation here, 0 and 9. And notice it's relatively flat distribution of population over all the ages. And what this has led to is that you will find working spaces with at least 3 generations. And every once in a while, you see a family-owned business where there's 4 generations. So you might see have a young person that just came out of university. You will have a mid-aged person, and then you're going to have an individual that is might be 65, but continue to work. And so you're going to you're faced with employee issues that are 3 generational, where the younger generation has different needs and wants than the older generation. So if we look at this particular picture here, we have 18 different faces here. And I always ask, especially from a European standpoint, what is so common about these 18 different faces? And the answer is they're all Americans. And so again, we have very ethnically diverse. Yes, our majority of our population came from Europe, and our sons and daughters of our European immigrants, but we do have a large population of African Americans here. Unfortunately, most of those African Americans are sons and daughters of slaves that came over in the 18th and 19th century. We have a growing population of Hispanic, Latinos, Mexicans, and from Latin America. They're moving from the South American, Mexico, Central America into the United States, and also for Asian population. So a number of immigrants that are coming from Asian countries, China, Thailand, Japan, Korea, and of course now quite a bit of multi-race marriages and children that are coming out of this. But the interesting thing is that the demographics experts believe that within 15, maybe 20 years, maybe even sooner, there will be no majority ethnic group. And so while we might be a country of immigrants, there will be no ethnic group that's going to be more than 50%. The largest growing ethnic group now, right now, is the Hispanics and the Asians. And the Hispanics are growing rapidly. Again, very family orientated. They tend to have more than 2 or 3 children. Same with the Asians. They're very family orientated, tight family organizations here. I mean, family structure, and they will be increasing in population. Again, our immigration today, most of it is from the Latin American community, whether it's Mexico, Central America, or South America, moving north. From a faith base, we're very focused on very organized, concentrated on Christianity. Again, this is from our immigrants and from history that many of our immigrants came from Roman Catholic countries as well as Protestant areas. So very focused on Christianity. But the biggest, and whether the Protestant group here, this 46 is the largest group, but it's made up of multiple religions, whether it's Lutheran, Baptist, United Methodist, and alike, but very organized, well-established Christian churches operate freely in every parts of the United States. But the biggest growing area, and you probably see this in Europe as well, is the unaffiliated. So the secular population that is more agnostic, that is not following any particular organized religion, this is the greatest growing part of the United States as well. Even though we have a number of other major religions and minor religions, whether it's Islam, Jehovah's Witness, which is in the Mormon, Buddhist, and of course Hindi, that's growing. Again, this is from our immigrants coming into the United States. We have 6 time zones. Most of us are in the 4 major time zones. So we're located here in the central USA. We have the Eastern USA, the Mountain Time, and then the Pacific. And what's interesting about this is that while we have time zones, we usually have the standard time zone and then daylight savings times. And that particular point is really at the state level. So once again, this is something that the national government can recommend, but it's up to the states to either decide if they're going to switch their clocks 1 hour in the spring and 1 hour in the in the fall. And there's certain states like Indiana, Arizona that do not switch, and that's why they're kind of gray colored here. That they do not switch. And then at the West Coast, we have the Alaskan time zone here, and then Hawaii as well. So from a European standpoint, we're looking at 5, 6, 7, or 8 hour, sometimes 9 hour time difference, depending on where who you're talking to within the country or North America as well. We're the only country that, well, I should say we're the largest country that did not adopt the metric system. And this is a historical thing that tried in the 1970s, 1980s, that we were trying to convert from miles in the imperial system. And it was fundamentally rejected by the populace. So when you're doing anything here in the United States, if it's outside of science and maybe engineering, almost everything else is going to be in the imperial system. So we're back at foots, inches, and miles, gallons and ounces. And what's interesting, you have 1 ounce in volume, but we also have 1 ounce in weight. So sometimes you have to talk about that when you're listening. Again, our temperature is in Fahrenheit, not Celsius. And of course, our currency is relatively at par right now. But there is a difference between the euro and the dollar. I think when we're looking at, let's say, instructional manuals or technical specifications, this whole area of imperial system versus metric, it would almost be better to actually put it in both. You're going to find in Canada that they do have miles, but definitely go into kilometers as well. And temperature, it's almost kind of like the UK, where you kind of know both systems. Well, in the United States, the vast majority of the individuals do not know the metric system. So because Shane and I are in the international market, and that's what we do, we understand the metric system, but most Americans have no concept of when you say 1 gram or 10 grams or 10 milliliters or 1 kilometer, what that really actually means. And so when you're looking at anything that you're going to be producing as far as literature or any kind of marketing collateral or instructional manuals or instruction for use or anything like that, you're going to have to be cognizant that you're going to have the imperial system when you develop that material. From an economic standpoint, we have a $20 trillion market, which leads to per capita about 60,000 US per individual. And of course, that puts us as the world's largest economy. And because we're the world's largest economy, I always find that it is a targeted market for almost every country that wishes to do business outside their home country. Because you can have a 1% market share and that be a huge market for whatever product or service that you're supplying. You could have a 0.1% market share, and that still could be a substantial amount of business here in the United States. And so we are the largest economy, but I would say we are also probably the most competitive economy as well. And then we're the 6th easiest place to do business, and we'll probably talk more about that tomorrow as well. By diversity, by region, again, by region, we have high concentration of manufacturing, the financial hub in New York here, Boston, investment capital is in these 2 particular cities here. The Southeast is the second home for manufacturing of autos. I would say the blue area here is heavy manufacturing, agriculture. In Tennessee and in Kentucky, these 2 areas are becoming a real hotbed for. In Alabama, these 3 states here are having Toyota plants. I believe Volkswagen is building a new plant here in Kentucky. This very advantageous to do business in these particular states. Tourism here in Florida. The Plain States are very agriculture, very low population density. North Dakota here has a large oil basin. Texas, in this western part of Texas and New Mexico, this is where the oil and gas is. And then we have California, where Silicon Valley, high tech, a lot of fruits and vegetables, wine from California, everybody knows. So agriculture, Excel, and in the Northwest here, we high tech as well. Microsoft is in Seattle, this particular area. So while we have diversity through the entire country, you're going to have concentrations of particular industries throughout. You mentioned that Chicago here in the Midwest here, we're the crossroads between east to west, north to south, and this tends to be a real hub for the rail industry. There are other hubs in St. Louis here. Again, in the middle of the country, we have hubs here in Cincinnati. This whole area here would be the central part of the commerce between east to west, north to south. And again, high concentration of rail operations, not necessarily the corporate headquarters of the particular rail operators. Our major ocean ports, we have many. We have Los Angeles, Long Beach on the west coast, New York and New Jersey on the east coast. We have the Port of Houston, which is a large port. Much of the LP gas is being exported from the Port of Houston. Smaller ports on the East Coast of Norfolk, Charleston, and Savannah. And then we have the Port of Seattle, which is in the northwest. And of course, we have other Port of Oakland. We have Miami has a port. Louisiana has a port. So we have all kinds of ports all over, depending on if we look at the Pacific Ocean ports here, the Atlantic Ocean ports here, and then a Gulf of Mexico ports here. So we have the Port of Mobile, but most of the major ports are here in New York, Port of the Port Authority of New Jersey, New York, the ports here of Virginia and South Carolina, and then of course the Long Beach and then Seattle as well.
Ken, I have a question.
Sure.
When you say ports, it's seaports, or you are considering also dry ports, inland ports?
No, these are ocean ports, so seaports as well.
Okay. Yeah. Because for us, it's also important to reach those inland ports, which can be seen as hubs and where freight can transit. So it's important also to maybe to put in the map or in the list the dry ports, inland ports. Thank you.
Okay. Well, great. Thanks, you. And on the airport side, now these, I would say that we have multiple airports, and the only ones that I've really listed here are if you're coming from the east. So if you're coming from the Middle East, Africa, or Europe, typically you land in Atlanta, Chicago, Newark, which is around New York, Houston, Dallas, Miami. And of course, UPS, FedEx, and DHL have their own ports, and they are typically located in the middle of the country. In those, we talked about Kentucky and Tennessee, so Nashville, Memphis, Louisville, Ohio. These are the ports where the air freight typically comes if it's UPS or FedEx. But if it's any kind of air cargo, typically coming from Europe, I would say these are the East Coast airports, I should say. Of course, if you're coming from Asia and the West, you have Los Angeles, you have San Francisco, you have Seattle, Denver, and if you're going to Las Vegas, you're going into Las Vegas and those particular ports of Salt Lake City. But these are the major airports coming from Europe.